Cutting ties with the International Criminal Court. South Africa plans to quit, accusing the court of bias against African countries. So why are all its cases in Africa? And does it matter if some nations leave? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, it's never happened before, but it looks like the International Criminal Court may be about to lose some of its members. First it was Burundi, now South Africa wants out. It plans to withdraw from the court that was set up to prosecute those accused of serious crimes against humanity. Several African states have accused the ICC of unfairly targeting the continent. Uganda's president went so far as to call it useless. South Africa's decision comes a year after the government was criticised for ignoring an order to arrest Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir whilst he was visiting.
Africa is in the process of strengthening its own human rights institutions and instruments to which we are party under the auspices of the AU. And our commitment is to continue to work closely with like-minded countries at AU level to ensure that South Africa continues to be the beacon of light in the promotion of human rights here and elsewhere in the world.
Well, the ICC was established in 2002 to prosecute people accused of committing acts of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. The court's prosecutor can investigate in member states, or the UN Security Council can refer cases to it. It's had 23 cases, most of them against Africa, but it's only handed down 4 guilty verdicts. Thomas Lubanga Diallo and Jermaine Katanga, they were the first to be convicted by the ICC. They were military commanders in the Democratic Republic of Congo who were found guilty of attacking, raping and killing civilians during a conflict in the early 2000s. The third ICC conviction was the former Congolese Vice President Jean-Pierre Bemba. He commanded a militia that committed murder and rape in Central African Republic. Bemba is appealing against the decision. And most recently, Malian fighter Ahmed al-Faki al-Mahdi pleaded guilty last month to destroying several cultural sites in Timbuktu. And then there are cases that were closed because of lack of evidence, like the one against the Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy William Ruto. Both were facing charges related to post-election violence in 2007 and 2008. More than 1,200 people were killed and 600,000 people were displaced. OK, let's bring in our guests now. In Johannesburg, we have Dewa Mavinga from Human Rights Watch's South Africa office. In London, we have Courtney Griffiths, former lead defence counsel for Charles Taylor. Welcome to you both. Can I start with you, Dewa? What do you make then of your country's decision to leave the ICC?
Thank you. South Africa's decision is unfortunate and quite startling in that it shows a complete disregard of justice and coming from a country like South Africa, whose history is that of, a hard-won legacy of standing with victims of some of the gravest abuses. It is quite disappointing in that regard that this is the turn of events, and we at Human Rights Watch urge South Africa to reconsider this decision.
What do you make of your Justice Minister's words? He says that Africa is in the process of strengthening its own human rights institutions. It doesn't need this outside court. Africa can do it for itself.
Well, when it comes to issues of justice and accountability, we need more, not less, institutions of accountability. And the ICC is the court of last resort in terms of justice globally. So its role and function remains, notwithstanding the strengthening of regional or African institutions in terms of justice and accountability. So what we need is more accountability and not less, and therefore there is no justification to say that we are focusing on developing African institutions and therefore we should do away with the ICC. That it shouldn't be like that.
All right. Courtney Griffiths, you've been involved in a high-profile international case involving a specially set-up court, that for Charles Taylor. But I'm wondering what you think about the ICC and whether this is the death knell, if you like, for the institution, now that we've had Burundi indicate that it's going to leave, and now South Africa.
Martine, one has to recognise that there is a precedent for withdrawing from the Rome Treaty. Because on the 31st of December in the year 2000, the Clinton administration signed up to the Rome Treaty and became a signatory. The following year in 2001, as we all know, 9/11 occurred, and the Bush administration decided to appoint itself as world policeman in the fight against global terror. And one of the first things they did as a prerequisite for taking military action overseas was to unsign from the Rome Treaty. So John Bolton, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, sent a 3-sentence letter to the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, saying quite bluntly, we no longer feel any legal responsibility to the ICC or indeed to the Rome Treaty. So in effect, the United States unsigned itself from that treaty. So it's not as if what South Africa is doing is in some way something novel. And indeed, I can understand as a black man why South Africa might have decided to make this move. Because what concerns me is this. From its very inception, it was made clear that certain people would be on, and certain countries would be exempt from the jurisdiction of the ICC. So, for example, our then Foreign Secretary, the late Robin Cook, after the United Kingdom signed up to the Rome Treaty, was asked on BBC Newsnight what impact that might have. And he said quite bluntly that the ICC is not a court set up to bring to book prime ministers of the United Kingdom or presidents of the United States. He said that quite bluntly.
Yes, but
so it's no surprise, therefore.
But isn't it well established, the fact that the ICC has been set up specifically to provide that arm of justice, that countries who don't provide the arm of justice for those countries who don't have that capacity themselves? And unfortunately, that is, for the most part, African countries.
Well, Martine, of course the establishment of the ICC was met with enthusiasm and optimism by many African countries, of course, given their history. But the fact of the matter is, since its inception, how can we explain this almost total focus on Africa and nowhere else in the world? Indeed, any country who commits crimes against humanity, if they have powerful superpower support, such as President Assad in Syria, it's unlikely that they'll be brought to book. And one consequence of that, putting it quite bluntly, is this. What has happened since the introduction of the ICC is the replication at an international level of that persistent and pernicious connection between blackness and criminality.
All right, Tom, I'm happy to say, can now join us. This is Tom Maliti, a journalist in Kenya who's specialised in the International Criminal Court in the last 5 years or so. And so we've just been hearing from Courtney, Tom, that the ICC has spent all of its efforts, all of its time concentrating on cases in Africa to the exemption of all other parts of the world. Therefore, the South African decision to leave is perfectly justified. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Tom, what do you think?
I don't think the South African decision is justified. I think that African governments are using the ICC as a way of shirking their own responsibility. The International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. If African governments were serious in their stance that the ICC is discriminatory against African countries, they have one recourse, they have one path they can follow, which is to strengthen their own national criminal justice systems so that the cases that could come before the International Criminal Court would actually remain in their national jurisdictions, and we can have African solutions to African problems. Without that, then African countries are basically leaving themselves open to investigation by the International Criminal Court.
And Doa, one of the reasons given by South Africa for this decision to quit the ICC is the claim that the immunity laws, the obligation under the immunity requirements of the ICC does not fit with domestic laws. South Africa has immunity for sitting heads of state, and of course the ICC does not approve of that.
Well, it is a lame excuse in the sense that South Africa should be able to fulfill its international obligations to justice and accountability, notwithstanding all other commitments. Because if you look at domestic law, the Rome Statute had been fully domesticated in South Africa in terms of the law of 2002. So what South Africa needed to do was to ensure that it fulfills its obligations within the framework of the ICC and not move out, because when South Africa signed on and ratified and then went on to domesticate the Rome Statute, these facts were clear at law. The reality is that perhaps this is just an excuse for South Africa now to stand with Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, who stands accused, and there's 2 ICC warrants of arrest, and South Africa then failed in its obligations in June 2015 when Omar al-Bashir was in South Africa for an AU summit. And that failure is the one that perhaps is now driving this move by South Africa to move out of the ICC and not necessarily the broader aspects of South Africa's obligations under the ICC, which it ought to respect and fulfill.
OK. Courtney, in London, I mean, you've outlined the often repeated accusation against the ICC that it unfairly targets African countries. But it's got, on its books, it's got 9 cases, or 8 or 9 cases at the moment. 4 of them have been referred to the ICC by the country involved, like Uganda, for instance. They sought out the ICC. There are only 2 cases currently on its books that it has investigated of its own accord. So it's not exactly a vendetta. It just might appear like that.
It's rather curious that this vendetta seems to only include Africa. And bear in mind also, Martine, it was Uganda who referred the Lord's Resistance Army to the ICC. Yet Uganda's president has now turned round and called the ICC useless. So one has to factor into your question the way in which, in many of the cases which have been referred to the ICC, domestic, national, political considerations are playing a part in the decision to refer those cases to the ICC.
So, well, do you think...
And also, what...
Do you think, then, that these countries, like Uganda, for instance, have the capacity, should they manage to find Joseph Kony and the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, do you think they have the capacity to be able to try and for him to face justice within a Ugandan context?
No. The way I put my argument is this. I do agree that African countries should disengage from the ICC, but I'm not absolving Africa of responsibility for dealing with these crimes. And it seems to me that it's time that African institutions, such as the African Union, give priority to issues of human rights and other crimes committed within that continent, and beef up its own institutions and takes collective responsibility for its own destiny, rather than leaving it to an outside institution based in Europe, funded for the most part to 60% by Britain, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, all former colonial countries. It seems to me it's time Africa now took responsibility for its own destiny and set up its own continental-wide institutions.
Indeed, I understand that this is underway. This is something that the African Union has at least set out a plan for. Whether it's any closer to becoming a reality, I'm not entirely sure. But Tom, can I ask you in Nairobi, because you've had personal experience of dealing with the ICC, you, your president and his deputy were actually indicted and called to the ICC. From your point of view then, where do you think the ICC fits in? Do you think it's a flawed institution that African countries should leave? Or do you think it's something that should be reformed? Or do you think it works perfectly fine?
I think African governments diminish their own power within the International Criminal Court's architecture if they do not, if they withdraw. I think they have not done an effective job in working as a bloc to present their concerns and to raise some of the issues that they wish to be addressed by the International Criminal Court as a bloc. I think that's one failing. In terms of an African court based under the structures of the African Union, the problem with that is who's going to pay for it? And secondly, the other problem with that is where is the political will? I'll give you an example. In Kenya, there have been moves to say that Kenya should withdraw from the International Criminal Court. At one point, there was a suggestion that a regional structure, the East African Court of Justice, should take over the international crimes cases that were being presented at the International Criminal Court. The problem is this. The East African Court of Justice, the presiding judges of that court, have for years been asking the heads of state to expand its mandate to look into human rights cases beyond the treaty-related cases that the court looks at right now. And the heads of state, to date, have not responded positively to that request. Secondly, the court itself is underfunded and understaffed. The judges are part-time judges, they're not full-time judges. And this is the same thing that will be reflected at the continental level.
All right, you've given us a list of the logistical and practical problems facing justice at this level on the continent of Africa. So, Courtney, I put it back to you then. In the absence of any realistic chance of getting a legal institution up and running and functioning well, what do you say about the ICC? Surely it can be reformed from within rather than having African countries leaving and dealing a blow to impunity, or the objective of trying to remove impunity from perpetrators of these very serious crimes?
Well, Martin, my answer to that is quite simple. The ICC was fundamentally flawed from its inception. Articles 13b and 16 of the Rome Treaty introduces a role for the UN Security Council, which has no business being involved in a so-called independent judicial institution. So we have 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, 3 of whom are not signatories to the Rome Treaty. That's Russia, China, and the United States of America. Yet those same countries who hold themselves above international law could nonetheless intervene, not only in Libya, but also with al-Bashir in Sudan, both countries not being signatories to the ICC.
Okay, so it's flawed. It's flawed.
How do you justify that?
Well, it's flawed.
Yeah, but
what do we do
how is
with?
that flawed to be remedied?
What do we do?
And it seems to.
What do we do with those perpetrators that are deserving to face justice?
Well, it seems to me that individuals like Tom, who are concerned about the underfunding of their local institutions, they should be agitating within civil society in their own countries to ensure that those institutions, legal institutions, are prioritized over other concerns. That's what taking responsibility for one's own destiny is about. It's creating the atmosphere and the environment within your own country to ensure that human rights are indeed taken seriously, rather than handing that responsibility wholesale to a court thousands of miles away in Europe.
And so, Dewa, I'll put Courtney's point to you. It is incumbent upon African countries themselves to build, to grow their own judicial institutions so that they can manage their problems themselves.
Certainly, yes, but that has always been the idea, that the ICC is the court of last resort, and that there will be, domestic courts and regional courts that would ensure that there is justice. But where victims are unable to get justice in their own countries and in their own regions, then they must have that option to approach the court of last resort for justice. And this is why it is important that in addition to the role of the ICC, Africa strengthens its own institutions, but should not replace or substitute the ICC with its own institution and do away with the ICC on the basis of a future position that they will develop in Africa, the relevant institutions. So what needs to be done first is for Africa to strengthen its own institutions and ensure justice, which means that if there is justice domestically and regionally, then there is no role for the court of last resort, but it remains there for those that cannot find justice domestically.
And Tom, coming back to you in Nairobi, you had, of course, the much viewed case of the president and the deputy president appearing at the court. It was shut down for lack of evidence. But tell me about the victims of the violence that was perpetrated by various people after the election of 2007, 2008. We're talking about 2,000 people who were killed, 600,000 people who were displaced. Do they feel that they have had justice? Have they seen justice as a consequence of what they've suffered?
The vast majority of them do not feel that they have had justice. Many of them feel that they have been neglected, left to their own devices. And it has to do with those who are displaced. Quite a number of them still are displaced. They have not been able to go back home. And then, of course, there are the injuries, both psychological and physical, that they suffer and continue to suffer, which have not been dealt with in a way that would help them feel that they can begin to rebuild their lives. And so some of them have actually gone to the local courts to seek the court's ruling that the government be held to account for what happened to them.
Oh, well, that's very interesting. Hopefully you'll come back and tell us what happens. But I'm just wondering now, what do you expect to happen, Courtney, first? Do you think that this will lead to an exodus of African countries from the ICC? And if so, does the ICC crumble?
Well, I think it may well lead to a mass exodus. And at one level, I welcome that. Because if, as history shows, all of the clients of the court, if I can style it like that, come from Africa, if that supply of defendants is blocked, what is going to happen to that court, which has cost billions of dollars to date, and yet has achieved very little? It would look to me as if we could be seeing the demise of the ICC if African countries decide en masse to withdraw. But I repeat what I said earlier. It therefore makes it incumbent on those countries who are withdrawing to ensure that they put in place proper, robust institutions to ensure accountability, not just for the warlords, but also for the presidents of countries in Africa who have been looting their treasury and their resources for decades.
All right. Can I thank you all very much indeed? Courtney Griffiths, Dewa Mavinga and Tom Maliti. Thank you all. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website aljazeera.com for more discussion. There's our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. But from me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.